Standards of rangeland health and guidelines for grazing management pull together two key components, science and people. On the scientific side, standards and guidelines will focus on the most basic components of healthy rangelands, the physical characteristics and ecological processes that need to exist to ensure functioning, sustainable rangelands. We recognize that there isn't detailed scientific information available for all rangeland components in all areas of the West. However, we hope to make complete use of what knowledge is available. Standards can go only as far as science will allow. We also recognize that science alone cannot ensure that healthy rangelands are achieved. People like you are the most important part of the equation. People's needs are provided for largely through the resource advisory councils and their subgroups. They provide local knowledge of resources and their uses, knowledge of how these resources are tied to the social and economic needs in your area, and experience in what management practices have really worked. The fundamentals of rangeland health set forth in the new grazing regulations establish BLM's policy for striving toward healthy, sustainable rangelands. Standards and guidelines are to be developed under the umbrella of the fundamentals. The fundamentals focus on the most basic components of healthy rangelands, the physical conditions and ecological processes needed to support healthy populations of plants and animals, and ultimately, people. The fundamentals also include requirements to meet state water quality standards, as well as meeting established water quality objectives that may differ from state standards. Finally, the fundamentals include maintaining or improving habitat of threatened or endangered species, candidates for listing, or other special status species. Because the fundamentals apply West-wide, they are broad in scope and did not provide the detail needed to apply directly to every on-the-ground situation. Standards for rangeland health make that connection. Standards for rangeland health are measurable levels of resource quality, condition, or function. They are to be developed locally, but will be documented on a state or regional basis. At a minimum, the standards must address the same components of healthy rangelands presented in the fundamentals, with the addition of addressing habitat quality for native plant and animal populations and communities. As standards address these components, they must be tailored to fit local conditions and needs. The difference between standards and fundamentals comes through developing standards specific to a state or portion of a state using local knowledge and input. Information provided by the advisory councils, the scientific community, and others will be used to identify the physical or biological characteristics of a specific area that can be relied on as indicators of rangeland health. In implementing the standards, the local BLM manager will be required to consider the data to determine if grazing use or levels of use are significant factors in failing to comply with the standard. If it is determined that grazing use is a significant factor, the local manager must decide on the appropriate course of action, for instance, an adjustment in seasonal use or the construction or modification of range improvements. Although everyone recognizes that it may take a considerable length of time before conditions can be corrected, the new regulations require that if changes in management are needed, they be made effective as soon as practical. While standards and fundamentals deal with conditions needed to ensure healthy, sustainable rangelands and are not limited to conditions specific to livestock grazing, the guidelines for grazing management focus only on grazing. Guidelines are acceptable or best management practices, treatments, and techniques that local livestock operators, other public land users, and local resource managers have found to achieve rangeland health standards. Because guidelines are based on local knowledge, their development hinges on input from the public and from you. As with standards, guidelines will be developed using local information and input, but documented at the state or regional level. Terms and conditions of grazing permits and leases are a principal way to implement standards and guidelines once they are developed. The standards and guidelines themselves probably won't be appropriate for direct use in permits and leases, but will be reflected in the terms and conditions to ensure progress toward the standard. By reflecting established standards and guidelines in the grazing permit or lease, we hope to ensure that the goals and measures of rangeland health and function are clearly understood by all involved parties. Terms and conditions are a critical communication device. To illustrate how standards for rangeland health and guidelines for grazing management are used, we can use an example of a riparian area. A standard for riparian areas might read, riparian areas are in properly functioning condition, including measures of sediment capture, groundwater recharge, bank stability, and flood energy dissipation. Guidelines that might address this standard could range from constructing range improvements to setting appropriate seasons of use. A guideline, for instance, might call for high-intensity, short-duration grazing of pastures containing riparian areas. In this case, the terms and conditions of the grazing permit would establish a corresponding season of use and stocking rate for the riparian pasture. Standards and guidelines will be developed through BLM's normal planning process. In many cases, existing plans contain decisions similar to a standard or a guideline. As we start the process of developing standards and guidelines, we intend to take a look at existing planning documents to help identify successful practices and decisions relating to rangeland health. We don't anticipate that many BLM plans will contain detailed standards or guidelines, but the plans and their associated environmental analyses may provide valuable material to which we can tie additional analysis rather than beginning from scratch. Because most BLM plans address issues or decisions in addition to those pertaining to livestock use of the public lands, a review of our planning base will also help identify how the standards for rangeland health and guidelines for grazing management fit in with or complement management of other public land resources. As advisory councils, your most important role when it comes to developing standards and guidelines is to help BLM ensure that science is applied in a practical, understandable, and usable way. Your councils are essential for obtaining and considering input from the public. Although the public will be involved throughout the process of developing the standards and guidelines, we anticipate that your deliberation of public input will yield great benefits. As advisory council members, you will serve as representatives of the local public in providing input, but you will also provide a mechanism for considering and forwarding recommendations that may represent the views of advisory council subgroups or other groups. Another key role of the Resource Advisory Councils is helping the BLM coordinate the development of standards and guidelines across the boundaries of council jurisdictions, including coordination across state lines. The diverse makeup of councils will ensure that a variety of perspectives will be considered, helping BLM to continue to blur the lines between various jurisdictions while accommodating local differences where appropriate. The BLM and the Resource Advisory Councils need to recognize the power of consensus-based decision-making and take full advantage of the knowledge and experience that everyone brings to the table. In developing standards and guidelines, you need to help us make science understandable and usable. Together, we need to take advantage of the knowledge that is already out there and make use of proven practices to reach a common ground for the long-term benefit of the land.
Joining us now is Mark Stiles. Mark, that was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
We also have with us now Carol Anderson. Carol is a representative at large on the Arizona Resource Advisory Council. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Mark, you had an opportunity when you're back in the headquarters office to work on the Healthy Rangeland Rule, and recently you moved to Colorado as the district manager in Montrose. So you may be in the enviable position where you've got an opportunity to implement some of the things that you created. We'd like to kind of hear your impressions at this point now that you've been in the field for a while.
Now that it's my turn to start working on this, there's no doubt that it's going to be a great challenge for BLM and also for the Resource Advisory Council members. There's a lot of work ahead. But in Colorado, we had the opportunity to meet almost a month ago for our first meeting of the Resource Advisory Councils, and I've been impressed with just how much enthusiasm and interest in the process and commitment has been displayed by the council members so far. In Colorado, we've also started off a little bit with our scoping meetings in the development of standards and guidelines. And at every one of the 5 scoping meetings so far, we've had representatives of one of the Resource Advisory Councils, at least one of the councils. And I think that's a demonstration of the type of commitment that we really have out there. Something that is becoming apparent through our scoping meetings and working with the council members is it's going to be critical to have the councils helping us and make valuable use of the public input. Public meetings can only go so far when it comes to gaining information, and that the councils are going to help us in bringing that information a little bit further, helping us refine it, give us more of a local viewpoint of it, and help us add a little bit more detail. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest roles for the councils coming up. Also, I think the councils it's a valuable mechanism for us to be bringing people in, other publics that we may not have thought of or we may not have tapped into fully yet. And I know, Carol, we've talked a little bit this morning about that you've had some experience here in Arizona before, and maybe you can fill us in a bit.
Right. We had the Black Mountain plan, the resource plan in Mojave County, and it involved the permittees, it involved the county, and I thought it was rather unique. It also involved the city because we were all impacted with how that plan would be developed and then, of course, how it's implemented. So we feel very fortunate that we had the voice in that planning process and the consensus of what is doable. And I think it's a plan that, through the RAC process, will continue to be a doable plan. I hope I can give some comfort to the other RAC members in that we're looking at plans such as these that it's already there, and we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That there's some really good things in these plans that are existing that should stay in, and then we're going to review them and see maybe what should be changed. But definitely those plans have a value for the RAC.
Mm-hmm. Carol, that's a really good point, that we make sure that we keep what's working and we build on that and we move forward. This is not a situation where we're just starting from scratch. This is a situation where there's areas where a lot of good things are going on and we just need to build on them.
Yeah, truly, they're building blocks.
Well, I think you're in a position to do it. I keep wanting to call you mayor.
No. We've been Bruce and Carol too long before we had those other titles.
You had an opportunity, Carol and Mark, to sit and watch the first part of the program, and we did have a couple of questions on standards and guidelines. I guess I was wondering if you have any other comments or something that you would like to add that maybe we didn't cover specifically in our responses to those questions.
Yeah, I have one I'd like to address, and this wasn't a plant, but Gary Sprung from the Southwestern Colorado Resource Advisory Council, which is the council that I work with, had a question about how much flexibility can be built into the standards and guidelines. And I think the question was answered well. I think if we view standards as being performance measures, that's what we're out there trying to attain. And these are performance measures for what the basic conditions are and processes that need to be present for healthy lands. Then those standards help us, whether it's grazing, we're dealing with grazing, off-highway vehicle use, mountain bike use, oil and gas development, whatever, we still can all focus on the same performance measure, what healthy lands are. And I think that's real important to keep that. Within that performance measure, we've got a lot of flexibility and different ways of attaining healthy lands, different ways to manage those uses.
Does that make sense to you, Carol?
It does, and I'd like to also add to it that just looking at healthy lands is a very broad brush of the whole picture, because healthy lands means that it has to be sustainable, and we have to look at the economics of it, because if it's not economically feasible, obviously it won't succeed. And so using all the players, the leaseholder, the community, and the effects on it, I think, are very vital, and that keeping that flexibility, because as we know, things constantly evolve and change, so that flexibility is going to be very important in the whole process.
Okay. We're going to be taking a break here in just a few seconds. Any comments before we go to break based on what we've heard so far?
I feel it's all been very positive. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, great.
I just want to underline, Mike's already said it, and Carol, your reference to the Black Mountain experience is good. There are, in every corner of this country, there are precedents for what's happening, and this really is an attempt to sort of recognize that and draw it up, and I hope we can do it in a way that doesn't kill it by bureaucratizing it. And I think we need to all really reflect on what is it that's made things like Black Mountain, Burrow Creek down south of Kingman, a lot of really interesting places. And a challenge we're going to have is how we do this with the right mixture of formality and informality so that it doesn't just turn into some giant kind of paper-pushing exercise that lacks the vitality of the ones that obviously have succeeded.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be part of the RAC, and getting that grassroots involvement, the people that serve on the RAC working with their communities and bringing the information forward and keeping that spur to us.
Bruce, you know, I can't resist making the point of my keep it simple again here when you mentioned let's not bureaucratize this, because, you know, the point is the challenge that I have and that you have and that all of the BLM managers have, like Mark and Larry, is we've got to figure out a way to get our resource managers to spend more time in the field and less time in the conference room. You can just almost see this from the 1970s forward, how we've gotten, the bureaucracy's gotten more complex. We spend more time in the conference room, and we just got to figure out a way to get out there and in the field, working with people, talking about real life problems. And I think a process such as this can help take some of the pressure off and get our folks out there where they belong.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break at this point to allow each council to prioritize final questions and comments. When we come back, we will open up the phones again, and we'll be looking for a question from each council. We'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back to Reaching Common Ground. We took a 15-minute break, and we had an opportunity to kind of check our pulse here and see what we were at. And what we'd like to do is go right to questions, and we're going to try to pick up the pace in the second part of the program and get to every site, and the goal is to get to as many sites as we possibly can with the time that's remaining. So where we'd like to start is in Ukiah. Tracy, you're on the air.
Hi, I'm just curious about the relationships of the RACs here in the Pacific Northwest to the provincial advisory committees under the Northwest Forest Plan, and whether there's any redundancy there, what our relationship is with the PACs, that kind of a thing.
Tracy, those groups, the provincial groups, are of course under different charters, and were established to move forward with the implementation of the President's Forest Plan and the ecosystem approach there, with somewhat different makeup. But I think the bottom line is I think the goals are very similar. I think as far as the RACs and the PACs, if you will, need to kind of learn from one another as well, and so I think there's the relationship is what happens on the land, and although there's somewhat of a different mechanism, different charters, different makeups, why I think that probably about covers it, doesn't it, Mark?
Mm-hmm. Nope, I think that's it.
Dickinson, North Dakota. Larry, you're on the air.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I have basically a two-part question. In light of the future of the National Biological Services, how can local expertise be utilized? And secondly, what kind of a performance-based monitoring / evaluation will there be to determine if standards and guidelines are sustainable at the local level?
Good, Larry. The second question, I think, is really central to all of this, because monitoring is important, and we all know that you could spend the gross national product of the United States of America monitoring rangeland. And it seems to me that the kind of stuff Mark was talking about, we got to have thoughtful, common sense approaches is really going to feed back into this monitoring. As we set these standards up, you're going to have to address that, and you're going to have to turn in each state and district and RAC area to the BLM and say, okay, what's available realistically in the way of resources, and how do we stretch them, whether it's through working with the state university agricultural programs, the Forest Service. It's going to take a lot of effort. Now, the Biological Service is really kind of off doing basic research for national objectives. One area that may be appropriate for them is the National Research Council did a study on rangeland health, and at the end of that said we need to develop more basic understanding of how monitoring systems work most efficiently, not in any particular place, but just as a research topic, and that might well be a possibility.
Okay, we're going to take a overwater flight. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going to Carol in Alaska. Carol, are you there?
Yes.
Has the sun come up yet?
I don't have any windows in here. It should be up, though.
All right, let's hear your question.
We were wondering if there will be a mechanism set up to continue communication among all the RACs so that we can share what we discover works for each group individually within this RAC process.
Interesting question. You may want to kind of have a clam bake like this, only move us out and just have the RACs talking to each other? That's an interesting idea. Unless somebody has a specific, I guess I take that as a suggestion that we ought to kind of try to think about.
Yeah. Was that the suggestion, Carol?
Yeah, especially up here in Alaska, we're far removed from all of you down there. And instead of trying to reinvent the wheel each time as each group figures out systems, processes that work, it would be nice to have a mechanism to share that with each other rather than work in an isolated sense. The specific issues will be different, but the processes should be the same, I would imagine. The ones that work will work everywhere.
Listen, I will say to Larry and Mike, this is something we really ought to work on. You know, I really don't understand much about caribou AUMs, but so I think it's a two-way street.
15 cents Bruce. Carol, I think the example of the use of this kind of technology is something that we need to use more of, and I think this is a good example of, hopefully we can use this kind of thing to communicate more and link various parts of the country together on these kinds of ideas.
You know, it's not just when we're dealing with different issues, it's also when we're dealing with the same issues that we need to coordinate between RACs across state lines, and I think that's something we need to work out with our advisory councils on the best way to do that.
We're going to go in alphabetical order, so we're going to go from Anchorage to Bakersfield, California. Bakersfield, are you there? Tim?
Yes, we're here.
Good. You got a question for us this morning?
Yes, I would like to ask the Secretary a question on process, and it ties in a little bit with the last caller from Alaska. First of all, how are our recommendations from this RAC going to be integrated with the other RACs? How are those recommendations going to move up to the highest policymaking level? And then how are those recommendations going to be implemented back down on the ground?
Well, I hope that in 99% of the cases, we can break that loop completely, and that what the RAC is talking about is implementation directly on the ground through the area manager, the state director. And that I don't envision your work product sort of routinely moving into some gigantic national bureaucracy. It ought to move straight out to the local land manager, who's going to be empowered to sit down with you and work this stuff out right on the ground. And I got to tell you, if it's working well, I'll never see it, and I shouldn't, because this really ought to stay local. Now, you know, I understand that as things begin to work and we learn things, there ought to be some way of sharing success stories, and I think that's something we can, it's a good point raised by the Alaska questioner, and something we ought to work on.
Montrose, Colorado. Bill, are you there?
Yes, this is Bill from Montrose. And the question is, how should we deal with the fact that it's not possible to maximize all of our goals for the land at the same time? Should we say that some goals are always more important than others? For example, that land health goals are maybe always more important than economic goals? Or should we identify different kinds of priorities for different kinds of areas? Or what should we do about this?
Well, I'm in the spirit of the RACs, I'm going to refer that to your local district manager.
Yeah,
Mark?
You know, I think that's comes down to maybe an understanding of multiple use also, that it's not always possible to do everything on one piece of ground at the same time. And I think effective multiple use management doesn't require that we even attempt to do that, but instead we view that what's the most important thing for the American people on that ground at that time and try to reach compatible uses. And I think the Resource Advisory Councils are going to be probably one of our most valuable tools in working out what are the compatible uses.
Bill, if you didn't like that answer, you can talk to him tomorrow in person. We're going to send him back down there. Okay, let's go to Elko, Nevada. Paula, you're on the air.
Hi, I'm directing this question to Secretary Babbitt. I'm Paula Brady with the Western Shoshone Tribes of Nevada. Is the RA committee going to have an opinion or impact on the unsettled issues of the Western Shoshone 1863 Treaty of Ruby Valley that Congress has requested Secretary Babbitt to deal with? You know, some of the issues are additional land the 8 Shoshone tribes are requesting.
Paula, I would think not. I would think that the issue you refer to falls in that category of national congressional legislation issues, which are kind of addressed by the parties in the congressional arena. So, you know, my initial instinct would be probably not.
Okay, we're going to go to Fran in Albuquerque, and we don't want to let Carol off too light here, so we're going to let her get the first shot at this question. I've got a little bit of a cheat sheet here, so I know what the topic is. So, Fran, question, please.
How will the Secretary work to balance the public land system to make all users, commercial and private interests, through fees and permits, more responsible for their actions on public lands?
Okay, Carol, how do you think the Secretary should do that?
That clearly is one for a mayor.
Yeah, a political response. I'll try not to be political. What I really think the way that this will happen, or should happen, is that the local people take responsibility in looking at what is happening on the land. And if it is something that is meeting the goals of that community, then they would work directly with the RAC, with their BLM people, and as needs be, on up the ladder to the Secretary's office to make sure that those land use goals in that local area are being met.
Carol, just in 10 seconds, I think it's really critical. I always am amazed when I drive down the road and see adopt a highway signs.
Exactly.
And I think, you know, here's the State Department of Transportation. It's got $10 billion and it can't even clean up the highways. And what's the magic of adopt a highway? It's that the local community is saying, this is something we're going to handle. And
this is important.
Yeah.
Ian from Riverside, California. You're on the air, Ian.
Good morning. I'm going to shift my question from something to do with my public at large status. What resources are available to me and to RAC members to reach out to the public we represent, i.e. internet pages? What types of resources can we expect?
Mike, what do you think about that one?
Well, I think that you know, if you're talking about money, that's one thing. The answer is none, and there's going to be less every year. But I think the real resource is the community that you represent, that you understand, that you need to take those interests and balance that with the interests of the other members of the RACs and move forward. I think that's really the function of what you serve, and most of the people that have been appointed to these RACs have got a tremendous resume as far as their understanding of the lands, the communities, the areas, the states they work in, and I think that's the real resource to draw upon.
You want to respond to that, Ms. Secretary?
Well, I guess I'd be a little more encouraging. I think that BLM ought to be able to kind of, from time to time, kind of scavenge and, you know, to the extent that it's legal, kind of, you know, sort of give you a little kind of pick-up help on communication resources and that kind of stuff. What I would advise you to do is make this a small issue rather than a large one. Show up at your BLM office on a quiet day and see if you can kind of infiltrate yourself into the system.
And I'll kind of quietly remember that offer, Bruce.
Okay, Bill, are you there in Idaho Falls? Bill, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
How about a question?
All right. like to share this question mainly with Mike, but I'm sure Bruce would like to get his licks in here. Mike, you've talked several questions or answered several questions about forest health and ecosystem management, etc. We all here in Idaho Falls would like to ask you another question about can we look forward to maybe using other factors besides water, as you put a lot of emphasis on water, as a driving force in ecosystem management, even though we understand water is important. You used the topic catch, store, and release on water. We'd like to talk about vegetation in that realm. Could you help us with that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And of course, you know, water is important to vegetation too. But I think the fact is, we're looking at we're looking at the geology, we're looking at the soils, we're looking at the vegetation, we're looking at the animals. You know, we're looking at the people that are there, the economic needs, and all those kinds of things. So there was you know, never an implication on my part that we only look at water.
I would add just one thing. The report from the National Research Council called Rangeland Health is something that I really encourage people to get familiar with, because it goes after rangeland health principally in terms of vegetation. And it says, you know, once you set a given goal for the use of the land, you really can look at vegetation communities and make a lot of good judgments. I found it very enlightening.
Mm-hmm. You know, on developing the standards for rangeland health, we are to address the physical components that are necessary to ensure healthy lands, and also the biological processes that need to take place. And really, when we get done with preparing our standards, we're going to be looking more at indicators of rangeland health. When we talk about healthy rangelands means to have stable soils, you have to have some way of recognizing that, some way of measuring that. Vegetation is going to be one of the best proxies or surrogate measures we have for that sort of thing.
Okay, Frank, are you there in LeGrand?
Yes, I am.
Frank, have you noticed the great customer service you've gotten this morning? We misspelled LeGrand, and it's already been corrected. What do you think about that?
Quick response, and we're very grateful.
Great. All right. Well, we'll take a question then.
My question would be, will there be some mechanism by which to measure the effectiveness of the RAC input as a whole, and then also of the various councils?
Well, I think you'll see the effectiveness in, you know, as you work forward and look at the, you know, not only the continued improvements in the land, but also the hopefully continued building of trust you have with the agencies, with the various interest groups that we all deal with.
Frank, I'd go just one step further. I think that's really an interesting question, and it maybe suggests that we ought to think about, you know, maybe a year from now having a session like this to hear people's assessment of how it's working, or to perhaps do it on a district or a state level. That's really a good suggestion.
I've written that down, Bruce.
Miles City, Montana. Nancy, you're on the air.
Greetings from Miles City, Montana. This is the Miles City RAC, and one of our concerns, being from rural counties, is what can be done to remove the population cap from the PILT to benefit the rural counties with less than 5,000 people.
Hey, Carol, what do you think? Would you sign on for that too?
I think that it's something that we really need to look at, because rural counties are facing a lot of the same problems as the urban areas, and that's growth. And how are we going to best use our resources, people, the land, etc.? And that's definitely a component.
By the way, pill checks are going out next week, I understand.
It's going to take that long?
Susanville, California. Dan, you have a question for us?
Yes, this is probably primarily directed to the Secretary, but certainly would welcome comments from everybody. Mr. Secretary, you're making at least some of us very nervous with your emphasis on the term consensus. The formal consensus process has a well-earned reputation of producing gridlock, tyranny of the majority, or at very best, lowest common denominator decisions. We understand the political expediency of consensus-type things, but I'd like some just real practical tips on how we're going to avoid these well-established traps that with consensus process.
I understand that sometimes the search for consensus simply doesn't work. But I think that it really can work. The groups that I've mentioned, this Trout Creek Mountain group in eastern Oregon, the Gunnison group in Colorado, the Black Mountain group in Arizona, there are a surprising number of really excellent examples of consensus. Now, you know, for every success, I suppose there is a failure, and that we need to acknowledge that maybe some of our efforts will fail. That's certainly a possibility. It seems to me it puts a premium on understanding the obligation we have as RAC members, not to characterize the other party's position, but to listen carefully to it, to search for common ground, ways that we can accommodate the needs of many people. There's a tendency to think that this is, you know, what I gain must be taken from somebody else. And the rangeland controversy, I think, has really drifted into that, you know, a rangeland improvement always comes by stocking reduction. Well, it's just not the case. You look at what Wayne Elmore has done with riparian restoration in the Pacific Northwest, and get Doc and Connie Baker from Doc and Connie Hatfield from Baker, Oregon, out, and they'll show you some remarkable examples of how everybody comes out ahead. There's no guarantee of success. I guess that's the bottom line. But I think there are plenty of examples out there, and what we ought to do is try to replicate them.
You know, I'd like to tie that to a question that came earlier. Frank and LeGrand, I think, had the one about how measuring the effectiveness of the RACs in the future. And I guess a measure that I'm kind of still working out personally for how it'll work for us in Montrose is that to be effective, I want to make sure that everybody has the views on the table. They put their views on the table, and that we all have a chance to understand the views. I think if we can all, 15 of us, can work on it and have an understanding of what's out there, that makes it a lot easier for us to reach recommendations. Oftentimes, we're in arguments for no reason. And what we really need to do is just get it out on the table, and then we can work it through and have an understanding. And if that occurs in moving towards consensus, then that's a valuable tool for us.
I'd like to underscore what the Secretary said, and as a kind of a citizen representative on the RAC, I think it's very, very critical that each of the RAC members keep an open mind as they come to these discussions, and that they take that extra step to understand the diversity of the viewpoints and so forth, so that when a decision is asked for, they are using all the information at hand. And hopefully through that we won't get into the gridlock, and we won't get into the animosity that can sometimes occur, and just keep that open mind and do our homework.
We're going to Phoenix, Arizona. Mark, you have a question for us?
You bet. I'd like to take the opportunity to reach out to the rest of the RACs. My position on the council is to represent recreation at large. To the other folks on the RAC committees doing that, please take into consideration the Americans with Disabilities Act and seek out your local governors, state representative for that. This particular group is going to become very politically active and can literally revamp some of the recommendations if we don't address their needs in recreation on our public lands. The question, sir, once we have reached our consensus and our state directors are incorporating them into their policies and plans, will current permittees and their permits be interrupted to incorporate these in, or will the multi-year original agreement remain in place and then be incorporated in?
Well, no, Mark, why don't you try that?
Okay. The language that really affects the way that we implement standards for rangeland health and guidelines for grazing management that's in the rule provides for a several-step process. First, the authorized officer is required to determine whether or not the standards are not being met, if there's a problem out there on the ground. The next step then is to determine whether or not grazing or grazing use, grazing levels, whatever, constitutes a significant factor in failing to meet that standard or conform with some guideline. If those determinations are made, then it's required by the rule that the authorized officer take action, responsible action, not later than the start of the next grazing year. Okay, but there are several steps involved in getting to that. The authorized officer is required to take appropriate action. In some cases, the appropriate action may actually be the modification of the terms and conditions of the grazing permit, and that there's a provision for how to go about doing that. And that's something that we've done over the years also, is modify them midstream if we need to. But the requirement would be to take responsible action that's deemed to be appropriate and determined to be necessary to take care of meeting the standards.
Yeah, I was just informed that we have a surprise phone call, and it's somebody inside the Beltway that's checking up on us this morning. And I'd like to welcome Bob Armstrong, who's the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management. Bob, are you there?
I am indeed.
Bob, you're not a RAC member. What are you doing calling in?
Well, I just have been listening to everything that you have said, and I find it's exciting and it's good. I just want to say that I hope that you will keep the things that are working and improve on them. The CRMs, the other things that have been good, we want to improve on. The other thing I'd like to say is that BLM, it's not like it was. We're, ever since the summit, we've tried to get this organization working with the people, working with unprecedented cooperation. And I'm really glad to see the way that we're coming to grips with some things that we haven't done in the past. I think we want to get as much help from the people that we work with. And I am really glad that this is the kind of way that we have chosen to do it. The final thing is I just think it's important that we keep the local level at the point that the manager works with the permittee. And I'll be out to a grazing committee meeting once in a while. I hope that I can learn, but I don't want to participate. I just want to watch it work, because I think it's a good thing for us to come in this direction.
Bob, thank you. Coming from a Texas rancher, I appreciate those words. I must say, Bob has walked me over every square foot of his ranch. It's a great ranch. I'm not sure it's a Texas-sized ranch, but it is a...
Well, it's only one section.
It is a beautifully run operation.
Bob, we wish you could have been with us here this morning, but we really appreciate the phone call. Thanks a lot.
Happy to be here, and I'm really on your side, because it looks like it's working.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing you in the West.
Thank you, sir.
Mary, are you there? Boise, Idaho? You have a question for us?
I sure do.
Great.
We represent the Lower Snake Region Advisory Council, and we thank you for this opportunity to ask the question. Our question deals with the Upper Columbia River Basin ecosystem and that plan, and how pre-existing resource management plans, how the two programs will interact, and what role the RACs will play in development of standards and guidelines for these programs.
Okay, the answer to that one's simple, a big role, because however the process for the Upper Columbia River Basin comes out, it will, in fact, tier down in whatever way over whatever period of time to the RMPs of the Bureau of Land Management. And that is, I think, a just perfect example of where these RACs ought to be, because the RMPs are really kind of a keystone document which reflects the best decisions about how it is that land's going to be managed. And as I said before, we really want to get moving on grazing because that's the issue before us. But this RMP process, I think, is absolutely at the heart of RAC participation. Mike, you've always felt that way, or you do now, right?
That's right. Yeah, in fact, I think, what we've learned in the Pacific Northwest, we're, applying to the Columbia Basin, and I think over the long haul that, will provide a good information base to move forward and avoid the gridlock that we've seen in the Pacific Northwest in the past. These are tough issues that they're dealing with. They are really, really tough issues.
In the rule, we recognize that there are some ongoing efforts like PAC-FISH where there have been developing standards and guidelines, and these things should dovetail in with that's what the intent was in writing the rule, to allow those things to dovetail in with the development of standards and guidelines for grazing management. So.
Okay, Spence from Butte, Montana. Welcome this morning, Spence. You got a good question for us?
You bet I do.
All right, let's hear it.
Yeah. Secretary Babbitt, there are many programs currently in place where the BLM is working in a collaborative way with local, state, federal agencies, as well as with private individuals and groups. There are agreements, memorandums of understanding, national stewardship programs, CRMs, already in place, both new and old. Incidentally, we have noticed that the CRM's national stewardship programs are not defined in the glossary of terms. We're wondering why, but my question is this. What should the relationship be between the RACs and the different groups and agreements that I've spoken of? And if the RAC reaches a consensus any of these programs, is the BLM prepared to help fund these types of programs with real dollars as well as with staff expertise and resource capabilities?
Okay, it seems to me that bearing in mind that the RAC is a statutory body with a overall advisory responsibility under statute, that it seems just clear to me that the RAC ought to be looking at these programs, reviewing them, sort of assessing what's worked, what hasn't, and encouraging the growth and development of what's working, not sort of erasing it all and throwing it aside and saying, we're going to write an entirely new chapter. It ought to be an organic process of working that stuff forward. Now, money is got a great big question mark after it, and I think we just need to kind of say that the future of funding for any particular program is up for grabs right now. My own view is land management does require the expenditure of money, and it's a subject that we're going to have to discuss with the Congress down through the BLM budget, and we're going to have to, I think inevitably, we talked about this briefly with the range improvement funds. We're going to have to talk about how we leverage money and how it is we match up whatever funds are available, and think a lot more broadly across all of the public land management agencies about how we use, in some parts of the country, CRP funds, in other parts of the country, the partnership in wildlife funds. There's an enormous amount of stuff available. None of it is, going to be sufficient to take care of everything.
Spence, your question about cooperative resource management and also stewardship, the same question came in from Dr. Laycock, who I believe was with the Wyoming Resource Advisory Council. And I think the Resource Advisory Councils will give us a way of working with the cooperative resource management efforts that are going on. We definitely don't want to supplant those in any way. And I know we've received information from the Society of Range Management encouraging us to make sure we continue making use of those. Those have been great successes for us in large part. There have been a few of them where there's been a question of whether there was a violation of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And I think by using the Resource Advisory Councils properly, we'll be sure to have a tool to keep us from any of those problems.
Great.
Modern technology is a wonderful tool, but sometimes it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. So we did have a backup system, and I'm glad to say that backup system is operating as we speak, because what we have here is a fax. It's from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, from James Whitaker, and this is a question that he would like to ask, and I'm going to put the question on the table here. What effect will ecosystem management have on private property rights, including water rights, where it crosses state lines, regional boundaries, and is intermingled with private lands?
The answer is none. I mean, what we're talking about here is the management of public land, and it stops at the boundary line of public land. It's just that simple. Now, you know, I confess it's not quite that easy. My family ranches on an Atlantic and Pacific Railroad grant, otherwise known as a checkerboard. And the public land that we lease is the black section of the checkerboard, and we own as private land the red half of the checkerboard. And obviously that means that there's got to be, you know, some real thoughtful stuff. But my advice to my family is we're not touching the red side of the checkerboard. They're saying, well, you know, cattle don't stop at section lines. Of course they don't, and that's been a historic reality in the West that we have to work out together. But the bottom line is public land management is about public lands. It's not about private lands. It hasn't been and it won't be.
Okay, let's go to Carl in Reno. Carl, you there?
Yeah, sure am.
Great.
We have a question for you.
Good, we'd like to hear it.
And our question is, how will the latest and best scientific and management information for our region be provided to the RAC?
That sounds like a good question for Mike.
Well, let me just say I think what we've got now is we've got a mechanism to educate as many people as we possibly can, and part of some of the answers to the other questions. One point that both Bruce and Carol made was information, education, local people working together, laying everybody's ideas on the table, and education is a part of this, and that's where your question comes in, and I guess our commitment is that we need to use the best information we have, the best technologies we have. The direction that the BLM organization is going is to move as much of the resources as we can to the field level. Our technical expertise, our best technical expertise should be at the field level, and maintaining linkages with the academic community, the land-grant colleges, and others. And so I think we're building some additional linkages here that we always haven't used in the past, but that's another challenging thing that we need to be vigilant and work on.
You agree with that, Carol?
Yes, I do. And I think we have to listen to the land and see how it responds, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a constant change. And if we listen to the land and the people that are working with the land, I think it'll work.
Grand Junction, Colorado. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning. Our pressing question from the Northwest RAC in Colorado is, how will the RAC address non-domestic grazing use, i.e. wildlife, while our authority is limited to controlling habitat and not wildlife numbers?
Yeah, big question. I suspect that's been asked once or twice all over the West about, you didn't have elk in mind, did you? Well,
I do.
That was on everyone's mind last time I was in Grand Junction. Look, the bottom line is that it's traditional American law that the management of wildlife is vested in the states and in the state game and fish commissions, or whatever it is you may call it in your particular state. There are some exceptions, but that rule is absolutely a valid generalization, and I think it always will be. And the bottom line is that no one has the power unilaterally to resolve these conflicts, because the bottom line is the State Game and Fish Commission has, for the most part, no control over stocking of public lands, so certainly not federal lands, and the federal land managers have zero control over the level of elk or other game. So what does that say? It says we got to learn how to communicate. I mean, this is a classic example of how we got to find consensus. And if we let this one drift into the courts, nothing will ever happen. And I would hope, to put it specifically, that the RACs will view this as a perfectly proper subject for discussion, particularly how it is that this issue gets joined between the sportsmen and the range livestock industries in a particular state. And if any of you can invent in your area a forum for that dialogue to take place. I can tell you, without fear of contradiction, that if you find consensus, that you're going to have a very receptive hearing at the State Game and Fish Commission, in the governor's office, and certainly on our side.
You know, the development of the standards, I think, will provide a good tool for this communication also, because the standards can't be developed without recognizing that there's use occurring from wild horses, in some cases, wildlife in nearly all cases, and it gives us a focal point that we can all come together on it and start discussing it. I think the development of the standards, that's an ideal place for the rest of the stakeholders and players to come in, whether it be the Division of Wildlife in Colorado or the Game and Fish in North Dakota.
Alan, welcome. You're on the air.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. We appreciate the opportunity to get together with you. There's been a recent movement of local county government to gain management of public lands. Are there any programs for pilot projects being planned or implemented to give local government the opportunity and the responsibility to manage or help manage public lands?
Well, see, I would argue that's precisely what these resource advisory councils are about. In each case, we have stipulated that local governments ought to be represented. And I think the one mistake that we tend to make is saying, well, title or exclusive authority ought to go to the Game and Fish Commission, to the governor's office, to the State Land Commission, to livestock permittees, to whoever. My own view is that absent something that I don't anticipate, the only way we're really going to make this land management stuff work is by saying it really isn't a question of title, and it's not a question of exclusive jurisdiction. It's a question of how we make and evolve these groups into collaborative, participative administration. Now, within that context, I think that we can still have a pretty interesting discussion about different kinds of shared management. There's some nice examples around the West and in other places. So, against at least my perception of this concept, I think there's a lot of room for RACs and everyone else to have very productive discussions about these kinds of things.
Craig in Lewistown, Montana, you're on the air.
Thank you, Larry. I'm conveying a question for Mary Sexton, a member of our Lewistown Resource Advisory Council. She was wanting to know what role, if any, the Resource Advisory Councils will play concerning mining permits on BLM and or Forest Service lands.
Mike?
Well, I think what we're looking at is overall guidelines of how the land is managed, but I think specifically into the details of mining permits, that's pretty much in the purview of the BLM area manager, to follow the procedures and guidelines therein. Now, would you like to add to that, Bruce?
Mike, I'd like to shade it just a little bit. I think that's basically correct. I think it's important to recognize that under the existing mining law, there are pretty detailed procedures which effectively say, because of the nature of the mining business, on the public domain, a mining locator has a certain set of preferential rights that come out of history, and minerals aren't everywhere, they're where you find them. And that when it comes to issuing a mining patent, there's really a pretty carefully detailed legal system. I think the one area where there is some real possibility for participation is in the formulation of the RMPs and land use plans, because if you look at those land use plans, they discuss these mining issues and have had some real influence across time in shaping the congressional response in specific areas. So Mike's right. Can you review a patent application? No, neither can I. It issues under the law if there has been a valid mineral discovery. But in the land use planning process, you can certainly raise these issues on a larger regional basis about whether in the future we ought to be moving in a different direction.
Salt Lake City, Utah. Ron, you're on the air.
Thank you. Our question is, how are standards and guidelines and the goal for healthy natural ecosystems to be applied or developed where the introduction of non-native species has significantly altered the natural system, and how much resource should be used to restore the ecosystem to its natural state?
That sounds like a question that we ought to give to the district manager and see if he gets it right. What do you think, guys? All right, Mark.
Okay. I mean, that's a very tough question. The basic physical components needed to ensure healthy lands and the biological processes needed may not in all cases require solely native species. And non-natives may fit into that. I mean, there are some situations such as southern Idaho where we have just a broad expanse of cheatgrass where it may be very difficult to ever attain the conditions that once were there prior to changes in land management, fire, and that sort of thing. The standards and guidelines as provided in the rule, the recommendations of things to consider in developing them definitely recognize the importance of having native species present and to avoid non-native species, especially those that are invasive plants, noxious weeds. But in terms of there will be some places where it may not be possible to return the land all the way. There may not be enough money to put onto it to return the land to its original condition or to a healthy native community.
Okay, we got time for one more call. Riverside, California. Bill, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
All right.
I have a question regarding wilderness and wilderness study areas. For the most part, this issue has been addressed in the California desert. However, it is an important issue throughout the West. My question for the Secretary is this. Is congressional resolution of BLM wilderness and wilderness study areas a high priority for your office? And if so, what actions have you taken or will you take to work with Congress to resolve wilderness issues?
My honest sense of that issue is that there isn't going to be a lot of progress on BLM wilderness designation in the foreseeable future. And the reason is there isn't much consensus. This debate has gotten so badly polarized that the going is awful slow. I regret that. Carol, during my tenure as governor of Arizona, we got BLM wilderness done for the entire state of Arizona. And the reason was, I don't mean to sound too self-serving, but I am proud of it. I got together with Senator Goldwater and Congressman Udall, and we sat down and said, okay, we've got Senator Goldwater, Morris Udall, and the governor. Now, we ought to be able to convene a consensus-building process, and it really worked. I mean, we banged heads, listened, put out the maps, and finally turned around and went to Congress and said, okay, the state of Arizona would like this. And it happened like that. I just think in a lot of areas, it's really out of my control, because until the state kind of generates a consensus, the Congress isn't in a mood to take these things on. So now, maybe, I don't want to stack so much straw on these racks that they collapse of, sort of unrealistic expectations. But if a rack were ever to tiptoe up on a consensus about these wilderness issues, I tell you, it'd be done by return mail. But I guess I would advise you to be cautious about biting that one off unless you've got some real sense that it's a tough issue.
Okay, we're into the closing part of our program here. And any last thoughts, Carol, you'd like to share with us?
I think just really overall, the RAC is a team, and I think we need to look at it. We're a team working within our individual states, but we're also a team working with the other RACs, and the idea of open communication, doing our homework, and representing the best interests and keeping in mind that it's a holistic process. One decision will affect other decisions, and one use will affect other uses, has to be kept in front of us.
Mark, you have some final thoughts or comments?
Well, I'd like to piggyback a little bit on what Carol said as far as the teams need to look at all the issues that are out there. I know it's been mentioned earlier today that grazing issues seem to be at the forefront right now, but the RACs need to recognize that there are multiple resource advisors. And in terms of just making sure that we get the issues out, we hear the views. The RAC members not only represent the the specific categories that they may be in, but they also represent the people that live in their area and scattered, throughout the state or throughout the region. They represent those folks also, and they've got this knowledge and these experiences that they can bring to the table, and we need to make sure those are out there. I think that's probably the most important thing for us, is to start talking about it to the point where we can reach an understanding, and then we can start forging consensus.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, this will be the ideal spot for your closing remarks.
Okay. Unaccustomed as I am to short closes, I would simply say, look, trust one another, listen, communicate, believe that this process can work. And in most of the cases it will, and we'll all be better off as a result.
Mike, I understand you'd like to make some comments to the Resource Advisory Council members.
Well, I would. Thanks, Larry. First of all, I want to personally thank every one of the BLM Resource Advisory Council members for being part of this process. You were selected to represent specific interests and uses of the public land. I know you care about the land. We do too. But your ultimate success depends upon your ability to represent shared needs. Progress will depend upon developing collaborative solutions that ensure sustainable and productive resources. Let's agree today to work together, to build bridges among the many people that use, enjoy, and value the public lands. We need you to carry back to your towns and communities a simple message that we cannot meet the needs of people without first securing the health of the land. You've heard me say health of the land many times today, and you'll continue to hear it as long as I'm around. Healthy landscapes profit us little if we fail to meet the needs of people. And Carol made that point, I think, several times very clearly. Long-term gains far outweigh short-term sacrifices. If American people do not appreciate that, then we won't succeed. The writer Leonard Hall once said, "We live in an age of material things, of techniques and processes, of goods and gadgets. It's easy to forget that in such a world we still live because of the resources of the land." Wise advice. History will judge us severely if we allow short-term needs to degrade the land that sustains us. And I know I speak for all of BLM in thanking you for helping us to pass on healthy, diverse, and productive lands to our children. Future generations depend upon us. The dialogue begins today, but by no means does it end here. And my sincere hope is that you will take the message of collaborative stewardship, of the importance of healthy public lands to your friends and neighbors.
Mike, thanks for those comments. Really appreciate that. I'd like to thank our guests for sharing their time and thoughts today. I thought this was an outstanding session. We got a lot of questions answered, and I'm sure there are a lot more to be answered. I know we were not able to answer all your questions, but your local officials will ensure that your remaining concerns are answered. This is only the beginning. Now we can all work together on reaching common ground for the future and health of our public lands.
To obtain a transcript of this program, please write to RAC Transcript, care of the BLM National Training Center, 9828 North 31st Avenue, Phoenix, Arizona, 85051, or call area code 602-906-5500. This broadcast has been a production of the BLM National Training Center.